By the way of a save the date notification, I'm pleased to tell you that our guest speaker for our annual conference the first week of August, which will be August 1st and 2nd of 2020, will be the producer of my favorite newscast, The Best of the Left, Jay Tomlinson. Our conference will be about the future of the news media as we see print media, newspapers, rapidly going extinct, along with an explosion of cable news and internet-based sources from podcasts and on YouTube, which are growing in influence, some of which is good and some of which is quite dangerous. Now, I consume a lot of news. Being well-informed is crucial to my job, and so I pay attention to TV and radio and print and internet news sources to the tune of several hours a day. But the most useful of my news sources is this podcast that Jay and Amanda put together twice a week. While most of my media diet is concerned with what has just happened, the last 24 hours, maybe the last week, Jay and Amanda will occasionally produce a Best of the Left episode that will pull the camera lens back to take a wide-angle view of an issue. You can learn a lot about the world by drilling down into the microscopic details, but you can't really grasp the flow of history by only thinking about today or the past week. I really appreciated an episode that Jay and Amanda produced in November of last year that looked at the rise and fall of periods of economic history between the Civil War and our current election cycle. Because of the way most of us are fed the news, we tend to see the political battle lines as a relative constant. It's always a struggle between liberals who want a more compassionate economy that provides services for the poor and the general population versus a more conservative view of economics that fuels the creation of wealth through investment and industry. But the truth is that there are economic eras. The line between what is a moderate view and what is a radical view slowly moves through the years. If I ask you to consider the span of time from the end of the Civil War to the present, at the end of our nation's practice of slavery, when the whole economy of labor and production was going to have to be recreated, there was a promise made to freed slaves that they would be allowed to claim a portion of the land that they worked, up to 40 acres, and to take a mule with which to work that land. This would have, at the end of the Civil War, given our black population an opportunity to meaningfully enter the American economy. But the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and the subsequent inauguration of Andrew Johnson brought that plan to a halt. Johnson was a Southern racist who was determined to keep black people in an inferior secondary role in America, and though the extremes of his racism resulted in making Johnson the first president ever to be impeached, he remained in office long enough to reverse much of the progress that had been won on the battlefields of the Civil War. Slaves who had built this nation's churches, government buildings, and agriculture were freed but penniless, inheriting only a destiny marked by poverty and violence that lasted for more than a century and a shadow of which continues into our day. Now, I'm not going to talk about reparations today as much as it needs to be talked about, but just for a second, if you would consider the value of 40 acres and a mule compounded by 160 years of interest, what the price tag of reparations would realistically be to bring the black population of America fully into the American economy. It's a huge issue, and it's difficult to argue against the debt being owed. But that's for another day. The Industrial Revolution that followed the Civil War did create a lot of wealth, but it went to the owners of the industries, while most Americans remained locked into poverty, especially the descendants of freed slaves. So the Great Depression saw a crash of an old economic era of exploitation and deprivation, with the nation economically on its knees and images of bread lines everywhere and everyone was poor. We saw a new era of economics ushered in through President Roosevelt's New Deal, which was furthered by wartime spending in World War II. I'm not sure that the New Deal would have ended the Depression, but the advent of World War II created a manufacturing base in our urban centers, which created a middle class. And in the creation of that middle class, most families of color had an opportunity to also improve their circumstances. And it was the rise of that black middle class, with its related increase in access to education, that fueled the civil rights movement. Without World War II's manufacturing base in the urban centers, we might never have had the educated and articulate civil rights leaders that helped to change the world. So from the Civil War to the Great Depression was one economic era. Then, after FDR's New Deal through Johnson's Great Society, was another economic era. But that era ended with two large events: the massive inflation during the Carter years and the subsequent election of Ronald Reagan. The Reagan Revolution brought in an era that cut taxes on the wealthy and services to the poor under a neoliberal Keynesian economic system that rolled back regulations and began a world-changing transfer of wealth from the poor and middle class to the top of the economic pile, a trend that has now continued for 2 generations. Now, when I mention Keynesian economic theory, that is simply the neoliberal view that you take away regulations and the government spends money only to stimulate the marketplace when it needs to, and then backs off of spending when the market is carrying things. And even recently, you know, our stock market has reached new highs, but salaries have continued to be repressed. If you see this next slide, all of us here, most of us here, can remember that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, most families only had one breadwinner, and that one breadwinner was able to provide a middle-class lifestyle for a family. They typically were able to buy a home and were able to retire at age 60 or 62. Neither of my parents went to college. And while we did not live as well as my cousins whose parents were professionals, I did grow up in a 4-bedroom, 2-bath home, and my dad retired at the age of 62. That was normal when the tax structure was progressive enough that people at the higher earning levels paid a higher rate of taxes and services were more available. All of that happened in the years following the New Deal. But since the Reagan tax era, that life has disappeared. Now it takes 2 incomes to run a family, and home ownership for most families is nothing but a dream. It takes 2 incomes to just pay the rent and stay off the streets, and retirement for many people is just a dream. Even, and talk about restoring coal jobs. I'm from Kentucky. There is not a single union coal job in Kentucky. They have killed off the unions, which kills off the health care benefits and kills off the retirement. So even if you recreate jobs that are going to pay $15 or $20 an hour, you will kill the worker and leave the family economically bereft. Now, we have reason to believe that this current economic era is dying. Let the congregation say, amen. I think it's been dying for about a decade now. The last throes of their death rattle is evident in the fact that this draconian worldview is no longer shared by the majority of American voters. If you poll American voters, Republicans and Democrats, about most of the issues that progressives hold dear, an overwhelming majority of voters, whether they're willing to say it out loud or not, are in favor of progressive goals. Conservative neoliberals have only been able to maintain a seat of power either in the White House or in the legislature by appealing to prejudice, blowing the dog whistles of racism, homophobia, xenophobia, and by ginning up fears, largely irrational, of terrorists and immigrants. If you look at, ladies and gentlemen, the threat posed by terrorists and the threat posed by the flu, you would realize that the flu is 1,000 times more threatening to Americans than terrorists. We don't need a Homeland Security office as much as we need to wash our hands. So, ladies and gentlemen, wash your hands. But that, coupled with seeking assistance from foreign totalitarian governments, such as Russia and Saudi Arabia, while suppressing votes among the poor through both gerrymandering and by removing people from the voting rolls and making it increasingly difficult for the poor to vote. I mean, who's off on Tuesdays? Are minimum wage workers off on Tuesdays to go vote? And we make it harder and harder for the poor to vote, or if you've got a criminal record to vote. So we keep drawing down the people who might vote for progressives. In short, Republicans have only held the White House or majorities in either the Congress or the Senate in the past generation by cheating. Now, that would be a horrible thing for me to say if it were not so evidently true. Amen. What it means to be a conservative and what it means to be a progressive or a liberal changes with time as the political pendulum swings back and forth. Those of you who've studied political science will remember the concept of the Overton window. It may not be part of regular conversations, but what the Overton window means is the window of what is politically possible. So there was a time when, let's say, the policy in the United States was slavery was the primary form of labor, agricultural labor in the United States, and it was popular with people that like to eat, right? But there was always people from the very first day of our colonies who didn't like it. But the people that thought it was absolutely the worst thing that could happen, they were way outside the window of probability. But through poetry, through music, a lot of the songs that we sing here were songs that were written and performed to move the Overton window on one issue or another to make things that seemed entirely unlikely to be much more palatable. Consider this. I was born in 1956. It's true, don't be shocked. I was born a dozen years after the flourishing of the post-war manufacturing boom. In that year, the Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, was running for re-election. This was his campaign platform. And I don't want to take the time to read all of it, and I see that print is too small for you all to read. But the principles of the Republican re-election platform for President Eisenhower included promises of worker safety, employment protection for the handicapped and the elderly, unemployment insurance, pension protections, equal pay for men and women. This was 63 years ago. Extending minimum wage laws to cover all workers, fighting employment discrimination that was based on either age or race or gender or immigration status, and vigorous protections of labor unions. Folks, in 1956, Dwight Eisenhower was more progressive as a Republican than Bernie Sanders is today as a Democratic socialist. So you see how the Overton window of political possibility moves to the left and to the right with various economic eras. At one point, child labor and slavery was in the middle of that Overton window. It gets moved to the left, and then such views become so extreme they're not even tolerated in public discussion. Unless, of course, you shop at Walmart, in which case you're still subsidizing slavery. But that's another issue. We see it playing out in this year's presidential primary season. Just 4 years ago, the ideas that got Sanders labeled as being crazy, tuition-free higher education, universal health care, taxing the rich, and guaranteeing a living wage, all those things were outside of the Overton window of political possibility 4 years ago. They were considered to be fringe ideas. And now those same issues are not just mainstream, but they are imperative, where you find a Democratic candidate who doesn't affirm those things to be constantly coming up with either a list of excuses or promises to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. 4 years ago, the Democratic Party was still locked into a Reagan-era economic set of beliefs and could hardly imagine anything else as being electable. And you know what? Maybe they were right. 4 years ago, maybe they were right to a certain degree. All I'm saying to you today is times have changed. As religious people, we have always been concerned about social and economic justice. That's what it means to have a spiritual worldview, right? That we practice radical compassion as a choice. We have always been advocates for the poor, and we have done what we could to provide direct aid. We started this church 12 years ago, and before we paid a dime in salaries, before we bought the first hymnal that we never used, our first project was to build a $50,000 playground for kids who lived in a homeless shelter. Every single week, every month of our existence, we have tried to raise necessary supplies for the local homeless. We have served tens of thousands of meals and distributed untold numbers of coats, sleeping bags, hats, and gloves. But folks, we always knew this was not a solution to poverty. These efforts have never been anything more than symbolic, momentarily meaningful to the hundreds of people that we gave aid to, but this is not a solution to poverty. We don't need to fight Keynesian economics or neoliberal thinking by finding 500 tents and 1,000 sleeping bags for Springfield's homeless. We need to change the economic system that keeps creating so much poverty. Amen. All of our years of making hamburgers and cookies, all of our efforts at feeding the hungry and getting helpful resources to the homeless was never a solution. These were exercises for us to learn compassion. And it was a short-term Band-Aid. I mean, we fed hungry people. We've given coats and hats to cold people. We practice compassion, though, to make it a part of who we are. So it changes the public dialogue within the city. It changes how we vote. It changes how we treat people. It changes what we tolerate. So in 2020, folks, we cannot tolerate a government that does not show the same level of compassion that we have been talking about here for a dozen years. Now, I realize that if you just watch the news, which is always telling you what happened today, breaking news, nothing makes the talking heads on TV happier than to be able to run that banner that says breaking news, as if nothing happened yesterday. Everything has to be as fresh as homemade bread. So if you only watch that and you're seeing all these protections rolled back against water pollution, air pollution, protections for endangered species, mileage recommendations or requirements for new automobiles, efficiency standards. If you just look at the micro movements of a seriously evil administration, you can easily convince yourself that we have lost the moral battle for America. And I know you're going to find this hard to believe at some point. But just consider with me that if you step back and take a look at the arc of our lifetimes, if you take a look at how the world has changed over 50, 60 years, the change from the New Deal to the Reagan era of economic cannibalism, can we call it that? I mean, really, if Keynesian economics seems complicated to you, just think of it as cannibalism. I see these draconian steps that Trump is taking as the last gasps of a dying empire built on Keynesian economics and a savage lack of compassion. There are those, especially the talking heads on network news and the billionaires who pay them millions of dollars to keep spewing propaganda at the voting public, who keep saying that the only way to beat Trump is to run a candidate against him who is almost like him in terms of economic policy. Folks, there are 33 Western democracies in the world. 32 of them have universal health care. The talking heads on MSNBC, NBC, CBS, CNN, as well as Fox, tell you that it's unworkable and unaffordable. And that requires you to believe that American intellect is inferior to 32 of the 33 Western democracies in the world. You would have to be genuinely stupid to believe that it cannot be done in America. And yet the talking heads keep telling us, oh, you've got to go with a safe candidate. You've got to go with a moderate candidate. We just want someone who's got a little more class and who doesn't tweet as much. They warn constantly that the left is wanting to go too far. I want to defer, as I often do, to the insights of the smartest man alive in the world today, Noam Chomsky, who has lately said, I quote, "I find it psychologically impossible to discuss the 2020 election without emphasizing as strongly as possible what is at stake. Survival. Nothing less." Does that sound like Mike Larson to you all? I'm just curious. He says, 4 more years of Trump may spell the end of much of life on Earth, including organized human society in any recognizable form. Strong words, but not strong enough. He continued, "The Democratic Party, in its apparent determination to kill the left wing, may very well end up ensuring a Trump electoral victory for a second time." Now, this is Noam Chomsky. I'm telling you, I think if I were on the ballot, I could beat Donald Trump. Amen. I think he is the most eminently beatable candidate in presidential history. But the only people who can't beat Donald Trump are moderates. And I'm going to vote for whoever is running against Donald Trump, whether it's a coffee can or a rock in the driveway. I'm going to vote for whoever's running against Donald Trump. But the only people that could lose to Donald Trump would be a moderate that looks too much like Donald Trump. Now, if you'll indulge me a moment to wade into the weeds once more, I know this is not a typical sermon, guys. Just take a deep breath. There's more coffee. We're going to get through this together. But economics is a kind of theology. I mean, it really takes faith to talk about economics. And in fact, if you're really going to believe what your economics professor says, it probably takes more faith than what it takes for your New Testament professor. But Keynesian economics is being replaced by what is called modern monetary theory. And modern monetary theory is so threatening to the Keynesian system that Republicans in the Senate have passed a resolution condemning modern monetary theory. Now, that's not that they can govern what people think, but they're voting on you really shouldn't think about modern monetary theory. But the theory is this, that we are not out of money until we are at maximum production. That is, resources are not unlimited. I mean, there's so much land, there's so much of water, there's so much resources to be had. But we are not out of money until we are at 100% of production capability. As long as there are idled warehouses and manufacturing plants, as long as there's farmland that we're paying farmers not to plant crops on, there is not a dearth of wealth until we are at full capacity. We have more empty houses in America than we have homeless people. So we don't have homeless people because there's a shortage of resources. There's a shortage of compassion. There's a shortage of conscience. And that's why churches exist. I mean, if churches aren't talking about this, they need to get religion, because this is where faith actually lives. We have the resources in America. We have the farmland. We have the building materials, the clay, the sand, the stone, the cement. We have the labor for everyone to eat well, be housed, educated, and medically taken care of. What we lack is sufficient political leadership and moral courage to do it. What I'm telling you today, in between the Overton Window and Keynesian economics and the modern monetary theory, is that the time for the economic era to turn the page of the calendar is now. I'm saying that the evil corruption of cannibalistic capitalism can go no further. We cannot allow it to eat another generation of Americans. In the years after the Great War, J.R.R. Tolkien wrote his Ring trilogy, a classic work of fiction. If you haven't read it, drop what you're doing and start reading it. But like all great fictions, it symbolically tells the story of the epic battle between good and evil. And as a great work of fiction telling that story, it's full of symbolism and inspiration. In the books, the good people of Middle-earth were threatened by the rising power of a dark lord who had to be stopped. The fellowship of hobbits, a dwarf, an elf, a wizard, and a couple of brave men set out on a treacherous journey to keep the Dark Lord from acquiring the power that he needed to bring Middle-earth to an end. In a desperate move, the fellowship took to an underground passage that took them through the deserted mines of Moria. And there they came face to face with a fiery demon of ancient days. The wizard Gandalf explained that the dwarves, because they were so greedy, had gouged the earth too deeply and awakened an evil that they could not survive. Well, now that doesn't take excruciating interpretation, does it? This economic era of cannibalism, masquerading as capitalism, has eroded the middle class. It has increased the suffering of the poor, as we have gouged the earth so deeply that we have spoiled our lakes, our rivers, our air, and our land in a fairy tale of continuous economic exploitation. We have unearthed a demon that can kill us. Those of us who have now lived for 3 generations and more, we know how morally bankrupt this economic system is. And you have to know that it cannot be allowed to go on any longer. In Tolkien's masterful tale, the seemingly fragile old wizard makes a heroic and self-sacrificing stand on the last bridge leading out of Moria, and he tells the Balrog that he shall not pass. Yeah, that's what I'm telling you. We have resurrected a demon from the days of the Civil War, a demon based on greed and racism and violence and war profiteering and spoiling the earth. And Gandalf the wizard gives us our line. This year, in this election cycle, as this economic era comes to an end, we say to that demon, "You shall not pass."
Amen. Yes. You cannot pass! Gandalf!
I am the servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Ulun!
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.